When the patient I saved walked into my office, she screamed at me, "You violated me by refusing to let me die." She was standing there perfectly healthy 10 weeks after I'd performed CPR for 12 minutes when her heart stopped in the emergency room, and she was serving me lawsuit papers while her lawyer stood behind her smiling. "You resuscitated me without my written consent. That's assault, battery, violation of my bodily autonomy." I stared at Rebecca, who'd been brought in unconscious after a car accident with no identification, no medical records, and no way to know her wishes. "You were dying. Your heart stopped. I'm an emergency physician." She rolled her eyes like I was stupid. "That doesn't give you the right to touch me, to break my ribs, to electrocute me back to life." I was finally at peace. Her lawyer nodded. "My client has suffered tremendous psychological trauma from being forced to continue living." He actually said that with a straight face. "She was unconscious. There was no DNR, no advance directive. The law requires us to save lives in that situation." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "The law? What about my spiritual journey? I was in the light. I saw my deceased grandmother. You ripped me away from paradise to suffer in this horrible world." She pulled out photos of her bruised chest. "Look what you did to me. Assault." Those bruises were from the CPR that saved her life. "Those are normal after chest compressions. It means you're alive to complain about them." Her lawyer jumped in. "That's exactly the problem. She didn't want to be alive to complain. You made that choice for her." Rebecca sat down uninvited in my office. "Do you know what it's like to be at perfect peace and then be violently dragged back to credit card debt and a cheating ex-husband and a job I hate?" I looked at her file. "You were 34 years old. Healthy. No chronic conditions. You had every chance at a full recovery." She slammed her hand on my desk. "I didn't want recovery. I wanted release. The accident was a blessing, a way out without suicide stigma. You ruined that." Her lawyer pulled out more papers. "We're seeking $3 million for emotional distress, loss of spiritual transcendence, and the ongoing burden of continued existence." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're suing me for $3 million because I saved your life?" Rebecca leaned forward. "You didn't save anything. You condemned me. Now I have medical bills, physical therapy bills for the trauma of being brought back. She'd been in therapy because her husband left her for her sister, not because I saved her life. Your insurance covered everything." She laughed. "Insurance doesn't cover the existential pain of unwanted consciousness." Even her lawyer seemed to realize how insane that sounded. "The hospital has security footage of you coding, of the 5 nurses and me working to save you, of your mother crying with joy when you survived." Rebecca's face went dark. "My mother? She's part of this lawsuit too. She told you to save me, didn't she? Her mother had actually arrived after we'd already stabilized her. Your mother wasn't there during the code. She came later." Rebecca turned to her lawyer. "Add her to the lawsuit. Conspiracy to force life." The lawyer wrote it down. "You realize every emergency room in the country will refuse to treat you now?" I said, "Good. Next time I want to stay dead." She pulled out a laminated card. "I made these. DNR cards. I wear 6 of them now. Necklace, bracelet, ankle, wallet, shoe, underwear tag." She showed me each one. "That's not legally binding. You need proper documentation." Her lawyer spoke up. "We're working on legislation. Rebecca's Law, making it illegal to resuscitate anyone without written consent, regardless of circumstances." I looked at them both. "That would mean letting children die, accident victims, anyone who couldn't consent in advance." Rebecca shrugged. "Not my problem. I only care about my violated rights." The hospital lawyer walked in then. "The lawsuit's been dismissed. Good Samaritan laws protect emergency intervention. Also, Rebecca posted on social media last month about being grateful to be alive for her nephew's birthday, so she contradicted her own case." Rebecca went red. "That was taken out of context. I was being sarcastic." The hospital lawyer pulled out printed posts. 63 posts about being blessed to survive, thanking the medical team, calling Dr. Johnson and Angel. You tagged the hospital, asking if you could donate to the emergency department that saved you. Rebecca grabbed for the papers. I was confused, traumatized, not thinking clearly. Her lawyer tried to salvage it. "Those posts were made under duress of unwanted life." The hospital lawyer laughed. "That's adorable. Now please leave before I call security." Mitchell Gorman closed the door behind Rebecca and her lawyer, then turned to me with his professional smile gone. He grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward the window where nobody else could hear. His voice dropped low. "Don't celebrate yet. She'll appeal, or file complaints with the medical board. Maybe both." I felt the relief from 30 seconds ago drain out of my chest like someone pulled a plug. "But you said Good Samaritan laws protect me." Mitchell shook his head. "They do. In court. But the medical board operates differently. They can investigate complaints even when lawsuits get dismissed. And trust me, someone that determined won't just walk away." He pulled out his phone and typed something. "I'm sending you my direct number. Don't talk to anyone about this case without calling me first. Not colleagues, not friends, definitely not reporters." I nodded, but my hands were shaking. "How long could an investigation take?" Mitchell grimaced. "Months, maybe a year. Depends on how much noise she makes and whether the board decides it's worth their time." He patted my shoulder. "Try not to worry. You did everything right. Just document everything from now on and keep your head down." I walked back to the ER 40 minutes later for my afternoon shift. The department looked exactly the same as always. Same fluorescent lights humming overhead. Same smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee from the break room. Same nurses chatting at the station. But everything felt different now. I picked up the first chart from the rack. 62-year-old male with chest pain. Standard evaluation. I'd done this 1,000 times, but my hand hesitated over the order form. What if he didn't want treatment? What if he had some philosophical objection to cardiac monitoring I didn't know about? I shook my head and wrote the orders anyway, but the doubt stayed there like a splinter I couldn't dig out. The next patient was a kid with a broken arm from skateboarding. Easy. Except I found myself asking his mom 3 times if she consented to x-rays and pain medication. She looked at me like I was crazy. Of course I consent. He's in pain. I ordered the x-rays but made her sign 2 extra forms I'd never used before. By the 3rd patient, I was running 30 minutes behind schedule because I kept second-guessing every decision. A nurse named Sarah asked if I was feeling okay. I lied and said I was fine. The shift dragged on for 8 more hours. Every time I made a clinical decision, Rebecca's voice echoed in my head. "You violated me." I kept seeing her face when she called saving her life an assault. By midnight, when I finally clocked out, my confidence felt like something that belonged to a different person. 2 days later, I was eating breakfast when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line made my stomach drop. Formal complaint notice, State Medical Board. My coffee went cold while I read through the attachment. Rebecca had filed a complaint alleging unethical conduct and violation of patient autonomy. The language was almost word for word identical to her dismissed lawsuit. She claimed I acted recklessly, that I ignored her fundamental rights, that I caused her lasting psychological harm by forcing her to continue living. The medical board was opening an investigation, and I had 30 days to respond in writing. I read the email 4 times trying to find some loophole or mistake. There wasn't one. Mitchell had been right. She wasn't going to stop. And then I called him immediately and he answered on the 2nd ring. "I got the medical board notice." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "What do I do?" Mitchell sighed. "Forward it to me. I'll draft a response. And prepare yourself because this is going to get worse before it gets better." He paused. "The hospital will probably want to do an internal review to cover themselves. That means documentation and observation. Just cooperate fully and keep doing your job." I hung up and stared at my uneaten breakfast. The eggs looked rubbery and wrong. I threw the whole plate in the trash. 3 days after that, my department chief called me into her office. Suzanne Emery was 50-something with gray hair pulled back tight and a reputation for running the ER like a military operation. She gestured for me to sit down across from her desk. "I received notice about the medical board complaint." She folded her hands on top of a manila folder. "I want you to know the hospital supports you. You followed protocol exactly as written." I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. "Thank you." Suzanne held up one finger. "However, the institution needs to protect itself. We're opening an internal review of the incident and your recent emergency decisions. Standard procedure when there's outside scrutiny." The tension came rushing back. "What does that mean?" She opened the folder and pulled out a packet of forms. "It means you'll be under formal observation for the next 60 days. Every emergency decision needs to be documented in detail. Every code, every critical intervention, every judgment call." We need a paper trail showing you're following best practices. I took the packet. It was at least 30 pages. This is on top of my normal charting? Suzanne nodded. I know it's extra work, but if this medical board thing escalates, we need documentation proving the hospital maintains proper oversight. It protects you, and it protects us. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. You're a good doctor. This will blow over. Just keep your head down and do the work. The internal review paperwork was brutal. Every shift I had to fill out detailed forms explaining my clinical reasoning for every significant decision. Why I ordered this test. Why I chose that medication. Why I intubated when I did. Normal charting took 5 minutes per patient. These forms took 20. I started staying late every single night to finish the documentation requirements. My shifts ended at midnight, but I wouldn't leave the hospital until 2 or 3 in the morning, hunched over a computer in the break room filling out forms while the cleaning crew mopped around me. After a week of this, my partner asked why I was coming home so late. I explained about the extra paperwork. Can't someone else help you with it? I shook my head. It has to be me. It's my decisions being documented. My partner frowned but didn't push it. After 2 weeks, the exhaustion started affecting my work. I was slower making decisions because I was already thinking about how to document them. I was more cautious, ordering extra tests I didn't really need just so I could write down that I'd been thorough. The nurses noticed. Sarah pulled me aside after a shift and asked if everything was okay at home. I'm fine. Just tired. She didn't look convinced but let it go. Fletcher Arias worked in the ER too. We'd been friends for 6 years, ever since he transferred from another hospital. We usually grabbed lunch together twice a week, and he always invited me to department happy hours and his kids' birthday parties. But 3 weeks after the medical board complaint, Fletcher started avoiding me. The first time I noticed was in the break room. I walked in and he was pouring coffee. Hey Fletcher, you want to grab lunch after shift? He didn't make eye contact. Can't today. Busy. Then he left with his coffee still steaming. I figured he was just stressed. But then it happened again. And again. He stopped sitting near me at staff meetings. When I walked into the break room, he'd suddenly remember he needed to check on a patient. He stopped inviting me to anything outside work. After 2 weeks of this, I cornered him in the medication room. Did I do something wrong? Fletcher looked uncomfortable. No, man. Just been busy. But he still wouldn't meet my eyes. You've been avoiding me since the medical board thing. He shifted his weight. Look, I'm up for a promotion next month. I can't afford to be associated with any controversy right now. The words hit me like a punch. Associated with controversy? I saved someone's life. Fletcher held up his hands. I know. I'm not saying you did anything wrong. But administration notices who you're friends with. I just need to keep some distance until this blows over. He left me standing there alone in the medication room. 6 years of friendship meant nothing when his career advancement was on the line. That night, I told my partner what happened with Fletcher. He's avoiding me because of the lawsuit. My partner put down their book. Maybe you should take some time off. This is clearly stressing you out. I shook my head hard. Taking time off makes it look like I did something wrong. Like I need to hide. My partner sighed. Or it looks like you're taking care of yourself. You're exhausted. You're working until 3 in the morning every night. When's the last time you slept more than 5 hours? I stood up from the couch. I can't take time off. I need to prove I'm still a good doctor. My partner's voice got sharper. You are a good doctor, but you're being stubborn about accepting help. This is affecting your health and our relationship. I felt anger rising in my chest. My career is on the line. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for you. The words came out harsher than I meant them. My partner's face went cold. That's not fair. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then my partner got up and went to the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind them. I slept on the couch that night. In the morning, we didn't talk about the argument. We just moved around each other like strangers getting ready for work. 3 weeks after the medical board complaint, my phone rang during a rare lunch break. Unknown number, I almost didn't answer. Dr. Johnson? The voice was male, youngish, overly friendly. This is Brandon Snyder from the Metro Times. I'm working on a story about the controversial resuscitation case, and I'd love to get your perspective. My food turned to concrete in my stomach. How did you get this story? Brandon laughed. Medical board complaints are public record once they're filed. I've been covering healthcare ethics for 5 years. This one caught my attention because it raises interesting questions about consent and bodily autonomy. I set down my sandwich. I can't comment on pending investigations. Mitchell had been clear about that. Brandon's tone shifted, more serious now. I understand, but I want to make sure the article is balanced. Your patient is willing to go on record. If you don't share your side, readers only get her perspective. The manipulation was obvious, but it still worked. My jaw clenched. I said I can't comment. Brandon tried one more time. The article is running next week regardless. I'm giving you the chance to tell your story. I hung up without responding. Then I immediately called Mitchell and told him about the call. Good. You did the right thing by not talking to him. Mitchell's voice was calm, but I could hear the concern underneath. But prepare yourself. Once this hits the press, things are going to get a lot more complicated. Brandon Snyder published his article 6 days later. The headline made my hands shake when I read it on my phone. Doctor faces scrutiny for saving life against patient's wishes. The article wasn't as bad as I feared, but it wasn't good either. Brandon framed the whole situation as a complex ethical debate. He quoted Rebecca extensively about her near-death experience and her feelings of violation. He mentioned that I declined to comment. He interviewed 2 medical ethicists who gave opposing views. One said emergency physicians have a duty to save lives without consent. The other said patient autonomy should be paramount even in emergencies. The article made it sound like both sides had equal merit. Like there was actually a debate about whether I should have let her die. The comments section filled up within hours. Half the people defended emergency medical protocol. The other half claimed I had violated Rebecca's rights. Some said I was a hero. Others said I was arrogant and playing God. I read every single comment even though Mitchell told me not to. By the end, I felt sick. The article got shared on medical ethics discussion boards and social media. Within 2 days, it had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. My name was out there now, connected to this insane controversy. Colleagues I barely knew started giving me sympathetic looks in the hallways. A few sent supportive emails, but mostly people just avoided eye contact. Rebecca gave a follow-up interview to Brandon 3 days after the first article. I found it online at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. The headline was worse this time. Patient describes violent assault during unwanted resuscitation. My vision went red reading that word. Assault. She described her near-death experience in detail. The white light, her dead grandmother waiting for her. The perfect peace she felt. Then she described me performing CPR. She said I violently assaulted her body, that I broke her ribs with brutal force, that I electrocuted her back to life against her will. She called it the most traumatic experience of her existence, worse than her divorce, worse than her car accident. Being saved was the worst thing that ever happened to her. The article included photos, her bruised chest from the CPR, her medical bills, a picture of her crying. Brandon's writing made me sound like a monster. Someone who cared more about playing hero than respecting human dignity. The comments on this article were even worse. People called me arrogant, power-hungry, a typical doctor who thinks he knows better than his patients. Some said I should lose my license. A few said I should be criminally charged. I read every word, even though each one felt like a knife. When I finally closed my laptop at 4 in the morning, I sat in the dark living room and wondered how saving someone's life had turned into this nightmare. The comments section kept growing. I checked it during my lunch break and counted over 400 responses to Brandon's article. Half the people defended emergency medical protocol. The other half claimed I violated Rebecca's rights. Someone with the username Medical Ethics Prof wrote 3 paragraphs about how patient autonomy must be respected even in emergencies. Another commenter responded that unconscious car accident victims can't communicate preferences. They went back and forth for 20 replies. I kept scrolling through more comments. A nurse from another hospital said she'd faced similar complaints after saving a suicide attempt patient. Someone else said doctors play God too much. Another person called Rebecca mentally ill and said I did the right thing. The arguments got heated fast. People called each other names. Some claimed I was arrogant and power-hungry. Others said I was a hero. I felt sick reading how many people thought I did something wrong. These weren't just random internet trolls. Some were medical professionals questioning my judgment. Others were lawyers discussing bodily autonomy. The debate felt real and serious, not just online noise. I closed my laptop and went back to work, but the comments stayed in my head through my entire shift. The hospital administration started getting calls and emails 3 days after Brandon's article published. Suzanne called me into her office on a Wednesday morning. She looked tired and had a stack of printed emails on her desk. She told me the hospital received dozens of messages about my case. Some supported me, others demanded I be fired. She showed me a few of the emails. One person wrote that I represented everything wrong with modern medicine. Another praised my dedication to saving lives. The responses split down the middle just like the online comments. Suzanne said the administration was monitoring the situation. Those words made my stomach drop. Monitoring the situation felt like code for considering whether to throw me under the bus. She assured me the hospital stood behind my emergency decision, but her tone suggested concern about the publicity. She asked if I'd considered taking some time off until things calmed down. I told her I preferred to keep working. She nodded but looked unconvinced. The meeting ended with her saying we'd revisit the conversation if the situation escalated. I left her office feeling like my job security had suddenly become conditional on public opinion. The Medical Ethics Board scheduled a preliminary review for 2 weeks later. I received formal notice in the mail with a date, time, and room number. Mitchell told me these reviews were standard procedure when complaints generated publicity. He said not to worry, but I worried anyway. The morning of the review, I put on my best suit and arrived 15 minutes early. The conference room had a long table with Elliot Barrett sitting at the center and 2 other physicians I didn't recognize on either side. They had my file open in front of them, along with copies of Rebecca's complaint and Brandon's articles. Elliot asked me to walk through my decision-making during Rebecca's code. I explained she arrived unconscious with no identification. Her heart stopped. I performed CPR following standard emergency protocol. There was no DNR, no advance directive, no way to know her wishes. The law and medical ethics required me to attempt resuscitation. One of the other physicians asked about my thought process during those 12 minutes. I said I focused on keeping her alive, not on philosophical questions I couldn't answer. Elliot wrote notes while I talked. The third physician asked if I considered the possibility she might not want to be resuscitated. I pointed out that unconscious patients don't communicate preferences. They seemed more concerned about public perception than medical facts. The questions kept coming for 40 minutes. Did I consult with colleagues? Yes, 5 nurses assisted. Did I document everything properly? Yes, all procedures were recorded. Did I follow hospital protocol? Yes, exactly. But they kept circling back to whether I considered alternatives to aggressive intervention. I explained there were no alternatives when someone's heart stops. You either attempt resuscitation or let them die. The review ended without any conclusion. Elliot said they'd discuss my responses and contact me with their findings. Elliot pulled me aside after the other 2 physicians left. He asked if I'd considered the philosophical implications of resuscitating someone who might have wanted to die. I stared at him for a few seconds trying to process that question. I barely restrained myself from pointing out that unconscious car accident victims don't communicate philosophical preferences. I said that emergency medicine doesn't allow time for philosophical debates. When someone's heart stops, you have minutes to act. Elliot nodded slowly like he understood but disagreed. He said the board needed to consider all perspectives, including Rebecca's subjective experience of violation. I asked if he'd let a 34-year-old woman die on his table to respect hypothetical wishes she never expressed. He didn't answer directly. He said these situations were complex and required careful consideration. The review would take several weeks to complete. I left the hospital feeling worse than when I arrived. The review ended inconclusively, which meant more waiting and uncertainty. Rebecca launched her social media campaign 2 days after my ethics board review. She called it My Body, My Death and created accounts on every major platform. The campaign advocated for legislation requiring written consent before any resuscitation attempt. She posted videos of herself talking about her near-death experience and how I violated her autonomy. She shared photos of her bruised chest with captions about medical assault. She wrote long posts about patient rights and bodily sovereignty. The campaign gained traction fast. Within a week, she had thousands of followers. People shared her posts and added their own stories about unwanted medical interventions. Some were legitimate cases of doctors ignoring advance directives. Others were people angry about being saved from suicide attempts. The campaign mixed real medical ethics concerns with mental health crises. Online communities picked up her message. Patient advocacy groups debated her proposals. Medical ethics forums discussed the implications. Even some legislators started paying attention. I watched the campaign grow with increasing alarm. Rebecca was turning her personal mental health crisis into a movement that could actually change emergency medicine laws. I found Rebecca's crowdfunding page during another late-night scroll through her campaign. She'd raised over $15,000 supposedly for legal fees. But her case had been dismissed months ago. There were no ongoing legal costs. The crowdfunding description talked about fighting for patient rights and funding advocacy work. People donated with messages of support, calling her brave and thanking her for speaking out. Some donations were small, $5 or $10. Others were hundreds. Someone gave $1,000 with a note about their own traumatic medical experience. Rebecca posted updates thanking donors and promising to use the money to push for legislative change. She'd turned her mental health crisis into a profitable cause. The realization made me angry. She was profiting from attacking me while I dealt with ethics reviews and professional scrutiny. Her dismissed lawsuit had evolved into a fundraising campaign. I closed the browser and tried to sleep, but kept thinking about that $15,000. My partner found me reading hostile messages on my phone at midnight. They asked why I refused to deactivate my social media accounts. I said I needed to defend myself publicly. They said I was making things worse by engaging with trolls and critics. We argued for an hour. I insisted people needed to hear my perspective, not just Rebecca's version. My partner said I was obsessed and letting the case consume my life. I said I couldn't just ignore people calling me arrogant and claiming I violated someone's rights. They said responding to every criticism made me look defensive and guilty. I said staying silent made me look like I had something to hide. We went in circles until my partner gave up and went to bed. I stayed up another 2 hours reading more comments and drafting responses I never posted. My partner was probably right, but I couldn't stop myself. A podcast called Medical Ethics Today contacted me 3 weeks after Brandon's article. They wanted to interview me about consent in emergency medicine. Mitchell advised against it. He said any public statement could complicate the ethics board review. But I was tired of only Rebecca's perspective being heard. I agreed to the interview. The host was a medical ethicist named Dr. Sarah Maxwell. She asked thoughtful questions about emergency protocols and the impossible position Rebecca's argument created. I explained that requiring written consent before resuscitation would mean letting children die, accident victims, anyone who couldn't consent in advance. Dr. Maxwell pushed back on some points but gave me space to explain my reasoning. The interview lasted 45 minutes. I felt good about it. I'd finally gotten to present the medical reality of emergency situations instead of Rebecca's philosophical arguments. The episode would air in 2 days. I hoped it might shift some public opinion back toward supporting emergency medical professionals. The podcast episode generated immediate responses from other emergency physicians. They shared their own experiences with ungrateful patients and frivolous complaints. One doctor described being threatened with a lawsuit after saving a teenager from a drug overdose. Another talked about a patient who sued for emotional distress after successful cancer treatment. The stories poured in through the podcast's social media and email. For the first time in weeks, I felt less alone. Other doctors understood the impossible position I was in. They faced similar situations where doing the right thing medically led to complaints and threats. Some reached out directly to offer support. A few invited me to speak at medical conferences about the case. The medical community was rallying around the principle that emergency physicians shouldn't be punished for saving lives. The support felt validating after months of criticism and scrutiny. Rebecca responded to my podcast interview 4 days later with a blog post. The title called me arrogant and dismissive of patient trauma. She completely misrepresented what I said during the interview. I'd explained the medical necessity of emergency intervention. She claimed I mocked her suffering and showed no empathy for trauma survivors. I discussed the impossibility of obtaining consent from unconscious patients. She said I admitted to ignoring patient wishes. The blog post twisted every statement into the worst possible interpretation. Her followers flooded the podcast's social media with negative reviews. They called Dr. Maxwell biased and accused her of giving me a platform to spread dangerous ideas. The podcast's rating dropped from 4.8 stars to 3.2 within 24 hours. Hundreds of one-star reviews appeared calling the episode irresponsible and harmful. Dr. Maxwell emailed to apologize for the backlash. I felt terrible that my interview had damaged her podcast's reputation. Rebecca had turned my attempt to defend emergency medicine into another weapon against me. The next morning, Suzanne called me into her office again. She sat behind her desk with that careful expression administrators use when they're about to tell you something you won't like. The hospital received complaints about my podcast interview. 3 board members called to express concern about my public engagement with the controversy. She suggested I stop doing interviews and let the situation calm down. I wanted to argue, but the exhaustion won. I agreed to stay quiet even though it felt like being silenced while Rebecca got to say whatever she wanted. Suzanne seemed relieved I wasn't fighting her on it. She walked me to the door and touched my shoulder in what was probably meant to be supportive, but just made me feel more alone. Mitchell called 2 days later with news about the medical board investigation. The preliminary review moved to a formal hearing scheduled 6 weeks out. He explained this was standard procedure when complaints gained public attention. The board needed to show they took concerns seriously, even when the complaints were ridiculous. 6 weeks meant months of uncertainty about my professional standing. Every shift would happen under that cloud. Mitchell tried to sound reassuring, but warned the hearing process would be stressful and I should prepare for detailed questioning about my emergency protocols. I hung up feeling sick. 6 weeks of waiting while my entire career hung in question because I saved someone's life. The publicity changed how patients treated me in the ER. A man with chest pain asked if I was that doctor from the news before agreeing to let me examine him. A woman brought in after a fall requested a different physician when she recognized my name. The nurse who made the switch gave me a sympathetic look, but the damage was done. Other patients stared at me differently now. Some seemed curious. Others looked uncomfortable having me treat them. The professional damage wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible and frightening and happening during every shift. I caught myself second-guessing basic decisions and wondering if patients were judging my medical care through the lens of Rebecca's accusations. Fletcher finally explained his distance during a rare moment alone in the break room. He admitted he was worried about being associated with controversy because he was up for a promotion to assistant department head. The selection committee was conservative, and he couldn't afford any perception problems. I understood his position intellectually, but felt betrayed that 6 years of friendship evaporated over professional self-preservation. We'd covered each other's shifts during family emergencies. We'd celebrated birthdays and commiserated about hospital politics. Now he was treating me like contamination he needed to avoid. He looked guilty when he said it, but not guilty enough to change his behavior. I told him I understood even though I didn't really. Our friendship was over and we both knew it. Rebecca's campaign announced plans to lobby state legislators for her proposed law. The My Body, My Death website posted a detailed legislative agenda requiring advance written consent for all medical interventions, including emergency resuscitation. The proposed legislation was medically nonsensical, but gaining political attention from lawmakers who liked appearing progressive on bodily autonomy issues. 3 state representatives agreed to meet with Rebecca about sponsoring the bill. The campaign framed it as patient rights legislation, and most politicians didn't understand the medical impossibility of obtaining consent from unconscious accident victims. I read the proposal feeling sick about how far this was spreading beyond my personal situation into actual policy discussions. The State Medical Society held an emergency meeting to discuss Rebecca's proposed legislation. I attended expecting unified opposition from physicians who understood emergency medicine realities. Instead, I found doctors willing to consider compromise positions. Some suggested requiring hospitals to attempt contact with family members before resuscitation. Others proposed mandatory waiting periods to see if patients regained consciousness naturally. The suggestions were absurd, but presented as reasonable middle ground. I stood up and spoke forcefully about the impossibility of obtaining consent from unconscious patients. I explained that waiting to see if someone wakes up means watching them die. I described the reality of emergency codes where every second matters. My voice got louder as I talked. Other doctors looked uncomfortable, but no one else spoke up to support the basic principle that emergency physicians shouldn't let people die while searching for hypothetical consent. Someone recorded my speech at the Medical Society meeting. The video got shared online within hours but edited to remove all context. The manipulated version made me sound callous and uncaring about patient wishes. It showed me saying physicians shouldn't wait for consent without including my explanation about unconscious patients dying during delays. The edited video spread faster than the full context. Comments called me arrogant and dismissive. People shared it with captions about doctors playing God. Rebecca's campaign reposted it as evidence of medical establishment attitudes toward patient autonomy. The full recording existed, but no one cared about accuracy when the edited version fit their narrative better. I watched my own words weaponized against me and felt helpless to stop it. I came home that evening to find my partner sitting on the couch with a packed bag beside them. They needed space because I was obsessed with the case and not the person they fell in love with anymore. I tried to argue, but they were right. Every conversation circled back to Rebecca and the lawsuit and the medical board. I couldn't focus on anything else. I'd become consumed by defending myself and lost track of everything that mattered outside the controversy. My partner stood up and picked up their bag. They said they still cared about me but couldn't watch me destroy myself over this. They walked out, and I stood in the empty apartment feeling like my entire life was collapsing. The relationship damage hit me harder than any professional consequence because it proved the case wasn't just affecting my career, but poisoning everything I cared about. Living alone for the first time in 4 years forced me to recognize how much the case had consumed my life and mental health. I barely recognized myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked exhausted with dark circles under my eyes and weight loss from skipped meals. I was angry all the time and isolated from everyone who used to matter. The apartment felt too quiet without my partner's presence. I sat on the couch where we used to watch movies together and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about anything except Rebecca and the lawsuit. My entire identity had narrowed to this one horrible situation. I was losing myself to the fight. Cassandra contacted me privately through the hospital the next week. She left a message asking to speak with me about her daughter. I called back expecting another confrontation, but instead heard an apology. She was horrified by Rebecca's behavior and wanted me to understand her daughter struggled with depression since her divorce. The lawsuit and campaign weren't really about me, but about Rebecca's untreated mental illness manifesting as displaced anger. Cassandra explained she felt powerless to stop her adult daughter from making destructive choices. She'd tried to convince Rebecca to drop the complaint and get proper psychiatric help, but Rebecca refused to listen. Cassandra's voice broke when she said she was grateful I saved her daughter's life, even though Rebecca couldn't see that right now. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and reframed everything I thought I understood about the situation. I didn't understand Rebecca until Cassandra explained it. The lawsuit wasn't about me or medical ethics or patient rights. It was about a woman drowning in depression who needed someone to blame for pulling her back to shore. Rebecca wasn't evil or calculating. She was sick, mentally ill and scared, and directing all that pain at the nearest target because I was there and doctors are supposed to fix things. The realization didn't make the damage go away or excuse what she'd put me through, but it added something I hadn't felt before. Sympathy mixed with the anger. Complicated sympathy that made me feel worse instead of better, because now I couldn't just hate her cleanly. I called Mitchell the next morning and told him about Cassandra's explanation. I asked if we could approach Rebecca's therapist somehow, get documentation of her mental state, show the medical board she wasn't acting rationally. Mitchell shut that down fast. Confidentiality laws made it impossible. Therapists couldn't share patient information, even if it would help a legal case. We were stuck defending against attacks from someone who needed psychiatric help instead of legal victories. The system wasn't built to handle this kind of situation where the person filing complaints was mentally ill and couldn't see reality clearly. We had to treat her accusations as legitimate, even though they came from untreated depression. The medical board hearing arrived 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning. I wore my best suit and carried a folder 3 inches thick with documentation. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Just a long table where 3 board members sat with Elliot in the middle. Mitchell sat next to me. 2 nurses from the ER came to give witness statements. Sarah from the day shift who'd helped with compressions, Rowan who'd managed the crash cart. I presented my documentation first. The code sheet showing Rebecca's vitals, the timeline of the resuscitation, photos of the accident scene from the police report showing the severity of the crash. No identification found on scene, no medical alert jewelry, no advance directives in any hospital system within 200 miles. I walked them through every decision point. Why I started compressions, why I used the defibrillator, why I continued for 12 minutes instead of calling it after 5. Standard protocol for a young, healthy patient with a shockable rhythm. The board members took notes. Elliot asked if I'd considered any alternative approaches. I stared at him. What alternative? Let her die? He clarified. Had I thought about the philosophical implications of my choice, whether forcing life on someone might cause harm? I explained again that unconscious patients can't express wishes, that emergency medicine requires immediate action, that every second of delay means more brain damage or death. The board members asked Sarah and Rowan about the code. Both confirmed everything happened by protocol. Standard emergency response. No deviation from accepted practice. No indication the patient wanted to die. Rowan mentioned Rebecca's mother arriving later and crying with relief that her daughter survived. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Elliot kept pushing on philosophical dimensions. Whether I'd reflected deeply on the meaning of my decision. Whether I understood the complexity of patient autonomy. I felt my control slipping with each question. These weren't medical questions. They were academic games. Philosophy debates while a real woman had been dying on a real table in a real emergency room. Finally, I snapped. I looked directly at Elliot and asked if he'd let a 34-year-old car accident victim die on his table to respect wishes she never expressed. Would he stand there and watch her heart stop, because maybe possibly she might have wanted to die if she'd been conscious to say so? Would he call time of death and then explain to her mother that he respected her daughter's hypothetical preference for death over life? The room went completely silent. Mitchell touched my arm, but I kept going. I said this wasn't philosophy. It was emergency medicine. Real decisions in real time with real consequences. Rebecca was alive because I did my job. If that was wrong, then every emergency physician in the country was wrong every single day. Elliot's face went red, but he didn't respond. The other board members looked uncomfortable. The hearing ended 10 minutes later with no indication of how they'd rule. Mitchell and I walked out to the parking lot. He looked worried, asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I was exhausted from months of defending basic emergency medicine, from explaining obvious things to people who should understand them already, from being treated like I'd committed some crime by saving a life. My outburst probably hurt my case, but I was too tired to care anymore. 2 weeks passed with no word from the board. I worked my normal shifts and tried not to think about it. Then the letter arrived. Official medical board letterhead. I opened it in my car before driving home. The board found no violation of professional standards. My actions were consistent with accepted emergency medical practice. But they recommended I complete additional training on patient-centered communication and consent. The qualified vindication felt hollow. They cleared me but still wanted me to do training, like I'd done something wrong even though I hadn't. Mitchell called that evening to congratulate me. I asked about the training requirement. He explained it was the board's way of closing the case while appearing responsive to public concern. They couldn't punish me for following protocol, but they needed to look like they took the complaint seriously. I was sacrificed for political optics. The mandatory training happened over 2 weekends. Saturday and Sunday, 8 hours each day. 20 other physicians in the room. Most looked as annoyed as I felt. The instructors talked about respecting patient autonomy, building trust through communication, understanding patient perspectives on medical intervention. All good concepts in normal situations, completely useless in emergency codes. I sat through lectures from people who'd never faced an actual emergency, who'd never done compressions on a dying patient, who'd never had to make life or death decisions in 90 seconds. They talked about taking time to understand patient values, about exploring treatment preferences, about collaborative decision-making. I wanted to ask how you collaborate with an unconscious person, how you explore preferences with someone whose heart isn't beating. But I kept quiet and completed the training and got my certificate. 3 months after Rebecca walked into my office, the whole thing finally lost steam. Her social media campaign stopped getting attention. The post got fewer likes, fewer shares, fewer comments. The online outrage cycle moved on to other controversies. Some politician said something stupid. Some celebrity did something shocking. Rebecca's story about unwanted resuscitation became old news. The internet forgot about her and moved on. But the wreckage stayed behind for me. I returned to normal ER shifts without special observation. Suzanne stopped requiring extra documentation. The hospital administrator stopped checking in. Everything went back to how it was before. Except it didn't. I'd changed how I practiced medicine in ways I couldn't quite name. I documented everything more carefully. Every decision, every conversation, every assessment. I consulted with colleagues more on borderline cases. Asked for second opinions when I used to trust my own judgment. I was more defensive, more cautious, less confident. The damage was internal and wouldn't show up on any performance review, but I felt it every shift. That certainty I used to have was gone. That confidence in my medical decisions was cracked. Rebecca's lawsuit failed, but she'd succeeded in making me doubt myself, in making me question whether saving lives was always the right choice. The doubt lived in me now, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. Fletcher caught me in the break room 3 days after the board decision came through. I was pouring coffee when he walked up and stood there until I had to look at him. He cleared his throat twice before speaking and told me he wanted to apologize for keeping his distance during the whole mess. He said the board made the right call and I'd handled everything professionally. I nodded and thanked him, and we stood there in awkward silence for about 10 seconds. He asked if we were good, and I said, yeah, we were fine. But we both knew something had broken that wouldn't get fixed. 6 years of friendship didn't survive him avoiding me in hallways and skipping lunch invitations because being associated with controversy might hurt his promotion chances. I finished making my coffee, and he patted my shoulder and walked out. The gesture felt empty, like checking a box on a list of things he needed to do to clear his conscience. My phone buzzed that evening with a text from my ex asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost deleted it, but curiosity won out, so I agreed to meet the next afternoon at the place we used to go on weekends. They were already sitting at our old table when I arrived and stood up to hug me, which felt strange after 4 months of silence. They apologized for leaving when things got hard and said they'd been following the case resolution online. I appreciated them saying it, but couldn't feel much beyond mild gratitude. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and they asked if there was any chance of getting back together. I said no, and watched relief flash across their face before the polite disappointment settled in. The lawsuit had revealed things we'd both been ignoring for years. They needed someone who could separate work stress from home life, and I needed someone who wouldn't abandon me when professional crisis hit. We were incompatible in ways that only showed up under pressure. We finished our coffee and hugged goodbye, and I walked to my car feeling lighter than I expected. Cassandra Hunt called me a week later, sounding more hopeful than I'd ever heard her. She told me Rebecca finally agreed to see a therapist named Tamara Gillespie, who specialized in depression and trauma treatment. Apparently, Tamara had a good reputation for helping people work through suicidal thoughts and displaced anger. Cassandra said Rebecca had been going twice a week for a month and seemed to be making real progress. She was taking medication now and talking about her actual problems, instead of channeling everything into the lawsuit campaign. Cassandra apologized again for what her daughter put me through and said she hoped this meant Rebecca would get genuine help instead of destroying other people's lives. I told her I was glad Rebecca was getting treatment and meant it. The anger I'd carried for months was fading into something closer to pity. Rebecca wasn't evil, just sick and looking for someone to blame for her pain. The letter arrived on the hospital stationery 2 days later. I opened it expecting more legal threats, but instead found formal notification that Rebecca's new attorney was withdrawing all pending complaints and appeals related to my case. The language was dry and legal, with no personal apology or acknowledgement of the damage caused. Just 3 paragraphs stating that all matters were considered closed and no further action would be pursued. I read it twice to make sure I understood correctly, then sat down at my desk and felt tension drain from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The relief was physical and immediate, like someone had lifted a weight off my chest. Mitchell would need to see this, but for now I just sat there holding the paper and breathing easier than I had in months. Suzanne called me into her office the following Monday morning. She closed the door and told me the hospital administration reviewed the case resolution and was satisfied with the outcome. The special documentation requirements were being removed effective immediately, and I could return to normal practice standards. Then she sat back in her chair and said something I hadn't expected. She admitted quietly that the institution should have defended me more forcefully from the beginning, instead of treating me like a liability. The hospital had been too concerned with public perception and not concerned enough with protecting a physician who followed proper protocol. She couldn't change what happened, but wanted me to know she recognized the failure. I thanked her for saying it and left her office feeling vindicated in a way the board decision hadn't provided. Someone in authority finally acknowledged I'd been hung out to dry. Brandon Snyder published his follow-up article 3 days later. I found it buried on page 6 of the local section with a boring headline about medical ethics case concluding with Dr. Cleared. The article was maybe 300 words and got almost no online engagement compared to his original viral piece about controversial resuscitation. He included a brief quote from the hospital about proper emergency protocols and mentioned Rebecca had withdrawn her complaints. That was it. No correction of the inflammatory framing from his first article. No acknowledgement that he'd helped fuel months of harassment by presenting a frivolous lawsuit as legitimate ethical debate. The vindication was officially on record, but nobody would see it. The damage was permanent, but at least the public record was technically corrected for anyone who bothered to look. I made an appointment with a therapist the next week because I finally admitted I needed help processing everything. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who specialized in professional trauma and burnout. I told her about the lawsuit and the medical board investigation and the social media campaign and the colleagues who abandoned me. She listened without interrupting, then asked about my sleep patterns and anxiety levels and whether I'd noticed changes in how I practiced medicine. I described the defensive documentation and constant second-guessing and loss of confidence in my own judgment. She nodded and said I was showing clear symptoms of burnout and anxiety that I'd been ignoring while focused on defending my reputation. She recommended weekly sessions to work through the trauma and develop better coping strategies. I agreed because I was tired of carrying the weight alone. 6 months passed between Rebecca walking into my office with lawsuit papers and me finally feeling functional again. I was working normal shifts and sleeping through most nights and not jumping every time my phone rang with an unknown number. But I'd changed in ways that felt permanent. I documented everything more carefully than I used to. I consulted with colleagues on decisions I would have made confidently before. I was more cautious and more defensive and less idealistic about medicine than I'd been before Rebecca. The certainty I used to have about doing the right thing was gone, replaced by awareness of how easily good intentions could be twisted into ammunition. I'd survived, but the experience left marks that wouldn't fade. I ran into Cassandra Hunt at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning in early spring. She was ordering when I walked in, and her face lit up when she saw me. We got our drinks and sat down at a table by the window. She told me Rebecca was doing much better on medication and therapy. She'd been stable for 4 months and had actually reconciled with her ex-husband, who'd been supportive once she started treatment. Rebecca felt embarrassed about the lawsuit now that her depression was managed and could see how displaced her anger had been. Cassandra said Rebecca wanted closure and asked if I'd be willing to meet with her to talk. The question caught me off guard. Part of me wanted nothing to do with Rebecca ever again. But another part was curious whether genuine resolution was possible after everything that happened. I called Mitchell Gorman that afternoon to ask his opinion about meeting with Rebecca. He was quiet for a long moment, then said it was my decision, but suggested having Tamara Gillespie present if I chose to do it. He warned me to be careful about anything that could be twisted into new complaints, but acknowledged that closure might be valuable for both of us. I talked about it in therapy that week, and my therapist agreed it could be healing if handled properly in a controlled setting. After thinking for 3 days, I called Cassandra back and said I'd meet with Rebecca at Tamara's office with the therapist present. Cassandra sounded grateful and relieved. We scheduled it for 2 weeks out, which gave me time to prepare mentally. I was nervous but curious whether facing Rebecca directly could finally put this nightmare behind me. The meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a small office with pale blue walls and 2 chairs arranged at comfortable angles. Rebecca walked in right on time, and she looked completely different from the angry woman who'd served me lawsuit papers months ago. Her face was calm, and her shoulders were relaxed, and she made eye contact without the hard edge I remembered. She sat down across from me, and Tamara sat slightly to the side where she could see both of us. Rebecca took a breath and spoke before I could say anything. She apologized for putting me through months of hell and explained she'd been projecting her suicidal thoughts onto me as a target. The words came out steady and clear without the frantic energy from before. She told me she'd been using me as something to blame instead of facing what was actually wrong in her life. I sat there listening and watching her hands stay still in her lap instead of grabbing at things or slamming tables. She kept talking and described her depression in detail. She explained how her divorce had crushed her sense of worth and how watching her husband leave for her own sister made her feel like she didn't deserve to exist. She talked about the credit card debt that kept her awake at night and the job that made her feel trapped and small. She said death had seemed like the only escape that wouldn't make her family ashamed of her. The car accident felt like permission to stop fighting, and when I brought her back, she'd lost that exit. She looked at me directly and said the lawsuit was never really about me or medical ethics. It was about trying to control something when everything else in her life felt chaotic and impossible. She needed someone to be responsible for her pain, and I was there performing CPR when she woke up. So I became the villain in the story she told herself. I watched her face while she talked and saw genuine understanding instead of the defensive anger from before. Rebecca's apology kept going and got more specific. She listed the harm she'd caused to my reputation and admitted she'd known the lawsuit was weak, but filed it anyway because she was angry at being alive. She talked about the social media campaign and how she'd encouraged people to attack me online. She mentioned the medical board complaint and acknowledged it was designed to hurt me professionally, even though she knew I'd followed proper protocol. She brought up the interviews where she'd called me violent and said she understood now that those words had damaged my relationships and mental health. She offered to make a public statement taking back everything she'd said and admitting she was wrong. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. I accepted her offer because I needed people to know the truth. She pulled out her phone and showed me a draft statement she'd already written. It was detailed and clear and didn't make excuses for her behavior. She asked if I wanted her to change anything, and I read through it twice. The statement acknowledged specific false claims and apologized directly to me and to emergency medical workers in general. I told her it was good and she should post it. I started talking then about how her actions had affected my medical practice. I explained that I'd started second-guessing every emergency decision and documenting everything in excessive detail because I was afraid of another complaint. I told her about the nights I couldn't sleep and the relationship that ended partly because I was consumed by defending myself. I described colleagues who stopped talking to me and patients who requested different doctors after seeing the news coverage. I shared how I'd lost confidence in my own judgment and started consulting other physicians on decisions I used to make without hesitation. I wasn't trying to punish her by saying all this, but I wanted her to understand the real consequences of using me as a target for her pain. Rebecca listened without interrupting or making excuses. She nodded when I talked about the professional isolation, and her eyes got wet when I mentioned my relationship ending. She didn't try to minimize anything or claim she hadn't meant to cause that much damage. She just sat there and absorbed what I was saying. That response felt like real growth instead of the defensive victim mentality from before. Tamara spoke up then and guided us into talking about what we'd both learned. She asked Rebecca what she understood differently now, and Rebecca talked about how she'd been treating death as a solution instead of addressing her actual problems. She explained that therapy and medication had helped her see that her pain came from depression and trauma that needed treatment. She said the lawsuit had been a way to avoid dealing with her real issues by creating an external enemy. Tamara turned to me and asked what I'd learned, and I talked about how vulnerable medical professionals are to public scrutiny, even when following correct protocols. I said the experience had taught me that doing the right thing doesn't protect you from consequences, and that the system doesn't always defend physicians who make ethical decisions. I admitted I'd been naive about how easily good intentions could be twisted into weapons. Tamara helped us see that we'd both been changed by the experience in ways that might actually make us better. Rebecca had learned to face her mental health directly, and I'd learned to be more aware of the complex legal and social environment around medicine. The conversation felt like it was giving us both something we needed. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end I felt lighter than I had in months. 3 days later, Rebecca posted her statement on all her My Body, My Death social media accounts. The statement explained she'd been wrong about everything and apologized to me by name. She told her followers she'd been suffering from untreated depression and had displaced her anger onto someone who'd saved her life. She encouraged everyone who'd supported her campaign to instead support emergency medical professionals who make difficult decisions under pressure. The post got shared a few hundred times, which wasn't huge, but people I knew saw it. Several colleagues mentioned it to me over the next week. The statement didn't undo all the damage, but it meant everything to have the truth publicly acknowledged. I saved screenshots of the post because I wanted proof that she'd admitted the lawsuit was wrong. I went back to work the Monday after Rebecca posted her statement, and the atmosphere felt different. People made eye contact in the hallways again, and a few nurses told me they'd seen the apology. Fletcher stopped me in the break room and bought me coffee from the machine. He said he was impressed by how I'd handled meeting with Rebecca and accepting her apology with grace. He admitted he felt bad about distancing himself during the controversy and said he understood now that he should have been more supportive. I told him I got why he'd protected himself and that I didn't hold it against him. We talked for 20 minutes like we used to before everything happened. The conversation felt good, but I knew our friendship had changed permanently. We were friendly colleagues now instead of actual friends. My relationship with my ex stayed ended, but I started seeing someone new about a month later. Her name was different from anyone in medicine, and she worked in graphic design. We met at a coffee shop when she asked if she could share my table during the lunch rush. We started talking, and I liked that she had no connection to hospitals or medical drama. She asked what I did, and I told her I was an emergency room doctor. She said that sounded stressful, and I laughed and agreed. We exchanged numbers and went out the following weekend. Dating someone outside medicine gave me perspective I'd been missing. She talked about client deadlines and design revisions and office politics that had nothing to do with life and death decisions. Her problems felt refreshingly normal. She knew about the lawsuit because I told her on our third date, but she didn't treat me differently because of it. The fresh start felt healthy and hopeful in ways my previous relationship hadn't been even before the lawsuit. Suzanne called me into her office 6 weeks after Rebecca's public apology. She told me the hospital wanted me to mentor a new resident starting the following month. The assignment felt like institutional recognition that I was back in good standing. I agreed immediately because I wanted to feel useful and trusted again. The resident's name was different from anyone I'd worked with, and he seemed eager but nervous on his first day. I took him through standard emergency protocols and showed him how to manage the organized chaos of the ER. During a quiet moment, I told him about the lawsuit and what I'd learned. I explained that saving lives doesn't always mean people will be grateful, and that the legal and social environment around medicine is complicated. I said he needed to document everything carefully and understand that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection from consequences. He listened seriously and asked good questions. Sharing my experience as a teaching moment made it feel less like wasted suffering. I found the nurses who'd been in the room during Rebecca's code and asked if we could talk. We met in the break room after a shift, and I thanked them for supporting me during everything. They said they'd been worried about getting pulled into the investigation and were relieved when it stayed focused on me. I told them I'd never blamed them or considered throwing anyone else under scrutiny. One nurse admitted she'd been documenting more carefully since the lawsuit because she was scared of being targeted next. Another said he'd thought about leaving emergency medicine because the legal exposure felt too high. We had an honest conversation about how the case had affected the entire team and made everyone more defensive. They expressed appreciation that I'd handled it without trying to spread blame around. The conversation reminded me that the lawsuit's impact had extended beyond just me and Rebecca. A year later, Suzanne called me into her office and told me I'd been nominated for the Hospital Excellence Award in Emergency Medicine. She said the nomination came from several colleagues who'd worked with me through the lawsuit and its aftermath. I stood there processing the information while she smiled and congratulated me. The award ceremony was scheduled for the following month in the main hospital auditorium. I accepted the nomination and thanked her for the support she'd given me during the entire ordeal. Walking back to the ER, I felt something shift inside me like a weight lifting that I'd carried. So long I'd forgotten it was there. The nomination felt like proof that my professional reputation had survived intact and that my colleagues still respected my work. During my next shift, I ran into several nurses who'd heard about the award, and they congratulated me warmly. One nurse who'd been in the room during Rebecca's code told me she was glad to see me getting recognition for doing the right thing. The ceremony arrived on a Thursday evening, and I wore my best suit and sat in the auditorium with other nominees from different departments. When they called my name, I walked to the stage and was accepted the plaque from the hospital administrator. I gave a short speech thanking the colleagues who'd supported me through difficult times without going into specifics about the lawsuit. Several people in the audience knew exactly what I meant, and their applause felt genuine and supportive. After the ceremony, I talked with colleagues in the reception area and felt truly welcomed back into the professional community. The holiday card arrived in my mailbox 3 weeks before Christmas, with a return address I recognized as Rebecca's. I opened it carefully and found a photo of her smiling next to her ex-husband, who had his arm around her shoulders. They both looked healthy and genuinely happy in the picture. The handwritten note inside said she'd been stable on medication for 8 months and was working as a volunteer crisis counselor at a mental health center. She wrote that helping people in crisis gave her purpose and made her grateful she'd survived to do this work. The card included an apology for the pain she'd caused and gratitude for saving her life, even when she couldn't see its value. I read the note twice and felt a complicated mix of relief and validation. Her transformation seemed complete and genuine based on everything Cassandra had told me over the past year. I put the card on my refrigerator where I could see it regularly as a reminder that sometimes the hardest situations eventually resolve in unexpected ways. The photo showed 2 people who'd found their way back to each other and to stability after crisis. I realized I was genuinely happy for Rebecca and glad she'd found help and purpose. The entire experience taught me that medicine exists in a world far more complicated than the clear protocols I'd learned in medical school. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection from consequences or gratitude from patients. The lawsuit and investigation scarred me in ways that changed how I practice medicine and how I view my role as a physician. I'm more careful with documentation now and more aware of legal exposure in every emergency decision. But none of that changes the fundamental obligation to save lives when possible and when patients can't make decisions for themselves. I still work in the same ER and still perform CPR when hearts stop and still make split-second choices under pressure. The difference is, I understand now that some patients will be grateful and others won't, and that my job isn't to be thanked, but to do what's medically necessary. I'm scarred but still committed to emergency medicine, with more realistic expectations about recognition and gratitude. The naive idealism I had before Rebecca walked into my office is gone and replaced with something harder and more durable. I save lives because that's what emergency physicians do not, because I expect appreciation or protection from the consequences of those choices.